You already know the story of Yellowstone's wolves. The success of their reintroduction is legendary, but like all good legends, on closer inspection, we might just have revealed a myth. One which has made us question whether restoring large carnivores is really beneficial at all. Last year, buried somewhere beneath the political headlines, controversy exploded around the world's most famous wolf packs. A long-term analysis of their impact on Yellowstone's ecosystem had just been published, and its results brought a very famous theory under close scrutiny. That theory is known as the landscape of fear. The term landscape of fear was coined at the turn of the century to describe how prey species behaviour might be influenced by a perceived threat. People tend to think that that means animals that can be eaten live in a constant state of terror, but it's not quite that simple. Here's footage I took of red deer in the Carpathian Mountains during a winter snowstorm where they are predated on by wolves. And here's some footage I took of the same species in Windsor, England, on a sunny day where wolves have been extinct for about 300 years. They're a lot more chilled. Yes, this is an extreme example, but it shows how behaviour changes with perceived risk. There is a spectrum here, it's not simply on or off. The Windsor deer are so habituated, they don't even see our truck as a danger, while the game herd, well, they weren't hanging around. Actively avoiding getting eaten is pretty common in prey species, and it's known as anti-predatory behaviour. With regards to Yellowstone, the popular conception is that the wolves excite such a significant anti-predatory response in the deer that they've stopped eating vulnerable young trees, and the whole river or riparian ecosystem has shifted to a healthier state. This kind of knock-on effect is called a trophic cascade. Trophs are just levels in the food web, like primary producers, primary and secondary consumers and so on. So in this case, we're talking about an effect that starts at the top, with wolves causing the deer to eat and reproduce less, and this leads to a domino effect where the riverbank trees are healthier, creating habitats for new species and even changing the river by reducing the undercutting of bends in the watercourse and slowing down the flow, helping the river's health improve. Because of this, it's long been held that it's the fear of wolves that has caused a change in Yellowstone from an unhealthy elk grassland state to the beaver willow state, a return to how the park would have functioned before the 20th century. But all of this might just be about to get thrown out of the window. A recent paper in Ecological Monographs argues that wolves did very little to change the browsing behaviour of elk in the ecosystem, and that the recovery of the habitats is due to something else entirely. The authors of this paper wanted to put the landscape of fear theory to the test, not with field observations, but by planning and carrying out a controlled experiment. To do this, 21 plots of land along the riverbank were selected for monitoring. These contained over 100 experiments. The variables were defined by fenced areas where grazing was prevented completely, dammed sites that replicated beaver interaction, as well as combinations of all of these. The control sites were left without any fences or dams and open to the elk's grazing. If wolves really had changed the ecosystem, then the researchers predicted that in years to come the sites with replicated beaver dams and fences would have the same level of willow growth as those control areas without any protection from browsing, because the presence of wolves would prevent the elk from overgrazing the young trees in these areas. Basically, if the conventional landscape of fear theory was sound, fear of attacks by wolves would prevent the controlled areas from being overgrazed, allowing that riparian habitat to return to the state it was before human intervention, an effect just as profound as the beaver dams. But they also predicted another outcome, one in which the landscape of fear did not exist. In this case, control plots would see just as much browsing as ever, while fenced-in areas would see increased willow growth. Dams would increase growing conditions for them even more by reducing erosion and allowing nutrients deposition. Early results wouldn't be enough to provide real evidence though, so to test the theories, the site would have to be monitored for another 20 years. The reason for this was hysteresis. A possible delay in the time between cause and effect, and in this case, wolves reappearing and the system reverting back to a beaver willow state. The popular belief was that wolves caused a trophic cascade almost immediately, changing the rivers within only a few years. But would it be evidenced in a controlled experiment? And so 20 years later, the researchers sat down and analysed their findings, and they found something kind of concerning. While the control sites did show an increase in average tree height, those fenced or dammed areas resulted in distinctly higher growth rates. The wolves had not in fact prevented grazing after all. This aligned with the hypothesis that the landscape of fear was in fact a false theory. Wolves had not initiated a return to the original state of the habitat anywhere near as well as the presence of beavers would, or the complete removal of elk, and definitely not as well as both of those scenarios combined. It seemed like the wolves of Yellowstone might have been freeloaders this whole time, reaping the benefits of protection from being hunted, yet offering nothing more than the occasional photo opportunity for tourists. But that's hardly fair, is it? Even though it wasn't as much as expected, these control sites did show regeneration of willows. So the wolves must have had some effect, right? In fact, 13 sites in the study had been equipped with trail cameras, which revealed how the elk's behaviour did change, as they began avoiding browsing at dawn and dusk when the wolves were more active, and during deep snow when they were most vulnerable to attack. But despite this, the study concluded that this alleged fear of predation wasn't responsible for decreased browsing of willow stands. It was more likely because elk numbers fell by more than half during the study, and the authors found wolves weren't chiefly responsible for this either. We were. Trophy hunters took almost twice as many Trophy hunters took almost twice as many elk as wolves in the area did, and so even the wolves' direct predation was still considered, only a minor influence. For all the hype, the inescapable conclusion was that reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone Park had not caused a large-scale trophic cascade. It hadn't really helped the willows re-establish, it hadn't helped the rivers become healthier, or for new habitats to be created. Perhaps the most iconic success story in American wildlife restoration has just been giving false hope to all the other attempts at rewilding inspired by its example. On their own, it seems wolves don't do a whole lot.
Hi, Editing Dark Wolf here, and I just realised I need to make a really important clarification at this point. The study isn't disputing that removing a keystone species like wolves degrades the ecosystem. What they are arguing is that restoring that species is not necessarily going to return the ecosystem to its original function. That's what we're talking about with hysteresis, that while the wolves were absent, this whole system has settled into a different alternative stable state, and it's going to be really hard to get it out of that because it's now self-reinforcing. I would have loved to do a really deep dive on hysteresis and the mechanics of it all, but we don't have time. But I just wanted to avoid confusion and not have people think that this is a anti-wolf study or something. That doesn't mean that I absolutely agree with everything they're claiming, and that's what we're going to get into now.
Hold on though. Why are we still talking about wolves on their own? When we look at the broader picture, it's clear that something fundamental is missing from this image we've been building up. Other studies have been quick to point out that wolves don't need to completely change the landscape on their own to still be important. The thing is, ecosystems are typically complex by default, and in fact it is often this complexity that makes them so resilient in the face of catastrophic change. Let's take a moment to look at those different trophic levels we mentioned earlier. You will often find lots of different species might fulfill a similar function, even the same function. This isn't a bad thing. It ensures that if one species goes extinct, then another with an overlapping life strategy can still pick up the slack and continue that same function. This functional redundancy is a bit like a power plant having tiers of fail-safes in place, so that when something does go wrong, the whole system doesn't just fall apart straight away. Of course, the more resources an animal needs to survive, the fewer of them you can fit into an area, and so while there's undoubtedly a lot of primary producers like trees and grasses and perennial plants in Yellowstone, whose ecological functions can still overlap, there's far fewer animals near the top of the food web. These can often be keystone species, and when they're removed, there's no good failsafe in place. The whole ecosystem is suddenly unbalanced. It changes and has to find a new stable state. But this is just reinforcing that point of hysteresis. If the landscape of fear is a false theory, then we can't expect to see any change resulting from the wolves' return. They had a purpose once, but now the ecosystem has shifted to another stable state, and it's a case of too little too late. And that might be the case, except for one thing. The fact is, the very paper that calls this phenomenon into question doesn't understand fully how it works, and that's not entirely their fault. We've tried to measure the effects of fear on prey species, but it was only around the time that this study was published that another paper identified a fault, not in the theory of the landscape of fear, but in its definition. The authors found that for all the different approaches that had been used to evidence it, none of them were very consistent or comprehensive, and so they suggested a new unifying definition. They suggested a spatio-temporal framework for studying predator-prey behaviour dynamics, with an emphasis on recognising that transitory hotspots of influence may develop in both dimensions. Or to put it simply, accepting how predator and prey interactions don't all happen in the same time and space. They're spread out, and this requires a very sophisticated model to interpret correctly. Let's take another look at that red deer footage I shot. Look at all the different features affecting their behaviour. There's a snowstorm obscuring visibility, the topography is steep, light levels aren't great, the forest obscures vision. Remember, predator-prey relationships are influenced by these and many other factors that just can't be controlled, like predator movements, seasonality, interspecific competition, the list goes on. So it makes sense that something as dynamic and multi-dimensional as this is not going to be accurately represented from a relatively simple controlled experiment, because only manipulating a few things like water table level and browsing access, they're only a handful of the variables in a massively complex system. So as thorough as the experiment was, the results don't likely record data in the areas or the times where wolves are making a difference, because nothing in the park is restricted to only those experimental areas. The landscape of fear may well have played a role, but one that played out over the entire park. The scale is just too large to accurately measure in the way that they tried. So if we really want to understand the scale of the trophic cascade in Yellowstone, we need to understand every aspect of it. In a sense, we were all wrong because we oversimplified the original problem down to only a few species. For now, the impact of Yellowstone's wolves can only be argued and debated because empirical, modelled evidence just can't exist. Personally, I agree that wolves are not a one-size-fits-all solution to every disrupted ecosystem, but the fact is they're a vital part of a complex web of life, one that for all our intelligence and resources we still can't put back together once it's disrupted, and which we depend on for our own benefit. So if we really want to understand the scale of the trophic cascade in Yellowstone, we need to understand every aspect of it. So if you enjoy the chaotic chorus of songbirds on a riverbank, or the freshness of a mixed forest, whether you're there to hunt or fish, relax with your family, or explore its challenges, then you can't attribute these things to any one species, because it's a web of millions of interdependent mechanisms that they can exist to begin with.